Hello, I'm John Walter, instructor for English 302, Advanced Composition, sections M01 and M03. And this is part 2 of the week 3 lecture, Making Claims, Giving Reasons. So if you haven't seen part 1, you want to watch that before you watch this one. So, to get on with the lesson here, in part 1 we reviewed the enthymeme, gave an overview of arguments, had our first look at claims, reasons, and evidence, and talked about incorporating the views of others into your argument. And in this lecture, in the second part of the lecture, part 2 here, we're going to look at items 5 through 8. We're going to talk about warrants and the idea of warrants as relevance glue. Going to take a look at and then 6, the idea of arguments all the way down, this idea that we build arguments upon arguments. Then talk about how to a few issues to consider when working with claims, reasons, and evidence. And then finally we'll talk about developing ethos when you're engaging in argument and developing your arguments. Okay, so warrants. Warrants, as Booth, Cullum, and Williams talk about them in the chapters from the Craft of Research, they talk about warrants as an issue of relevance. And as they note, basically a warrant is a general principle that connects a claim and its reason. And the key to a warrant's effectiveness is its relevance to the argument being made. As they note, you can make an argument something along the lines of, we need to feed homeless people because 2 + 2 = 4. Sure, you've got a claim there, you've got something that's claims to be a reason. However, the 2 + 2 = 4 has no relevance whatsoever to this idea that we need to feed homeless people, and therefore you can say that it's a reason supporting your claim, but unless your audience actually sees the relevance of your reason to your claim, it's not going to work. The audience needs to understand the relevance, the connection that it's actually being made. And this is why I refer to warrants actually as relevance glue, because you can think about the quality of the glue and how sticky it is, how well it keeps something glued together. So a really strong warrant, a really strong connection between your claim and your evidence, it's held together, because the warrant is what holds it together. It's a general principle that holds your claim and your reason together. And therefore, a really strong warrant works as really strong glue, sticky glue that holds things together really well. Whereas a really bad warrant has really no stickiness, has no effectiveness in holding things together. So again, you can think of warrants as this relevance glue. So, when the claim, because reason format, is expressed as an enthymeme, because remember from lecture 1, part 1 of this lecture, talked about how that aspect, they've got, their basic formula for an argument is claim because of reason supported by evidence. When the claim, the claim because of reason format is actually essentially the enthymeme that we've talked about since week 1. So, if we think of the claim because of reason format as an enthymeme, or if we actually have that aspect of our argument expressed as an enthymeme, then the warrant is actually going to be the enthymeme's unstated assumption. So we talk about the unstated assumption is the assumption that holds the reason and the claim together. The warrant is the relevant connection that holds your claim and reason together. So they function the same, so they function the same. So a warrant's relevance is determined by the audience, and it's up to the author to evaluate the likelihood that their audience will accept their warrant, will understand the connection that they're trying to make, and in evaluating their audience's needs as to what they need to do to make sure the audience understands the relevance of the warrant and how it connects the claim and the reason together. And the Williams, Booth, and Cullum offer us an example on page 114 of the Craft of Research. They write as an argument, we are facing significantly higher health costs in Europe and North America because global warming is moving the line of extended hard freezes steadily northward. As I note, you can make that argument. There's a claim, there's a reason. What connects the claim and the reason together is not readily apparent to everyone. Which is not surprising. Because to understand how it's apparent, how they are apparent, you actually need to understand the connection between hard freezes, subtropical insects, disease, and medical costs. And not only do you have to understand those things, you actually have to be in the frame of mind in which you are going to make all those connections as you hear that claim, as you read that claim as it exists, and that argument as it exists, that sort of one-sentence argument. And if your brain isn't just sort of, if you're not ready, if you're not properly prepared to make all those connections and have all those connections in mind, you may hear that and not recognize the relevance or the connection immediately. And so again, it's up to the author, it's up to the person making the argument to figure out what their audience is going to need. So, as we talk about this idea of warrants, a warrant that, for your audience to accept your argument, they're going to need to accept your warrant. And so we need to understand the logic of warrants, how warrants work. And as Williams, Booth, and Cullum argue, or they state, warrants require our audience, for an audience to accept a warrant, they need to agree to 4 conditions. They need to accept that the warrant is true. They need to accept that the reason is true. So, because obviously, generally, when you're making an argument, what's at stake, what's at issue, is whether or not your claim is true. And so your warrant needs to be true, your audience needs to accept your warrant as true, and your audience needs to accept your reason as true. And those are the 2 first factors, and those are the easy ones. The other 2 things that your audience must accept is that the specific circumstance in the reason qualifies as a plausible instance of the general circumstance in the warrant. Now, let's break that down, kind of unpack that a little bit. It's stating here the specific circumstance in the reason. So the idea that reasons deal with specific circumstances. That might make sense. Your reason is about a specific thing. If I wanted to make the argument that we need to actually collect food and go out into the community to take it to homeless people because we have a food shortage and there's a real crisis going on right now. That's a specific circumstance, because in a larger, there are other ways actually to help homeless people, and we can debate all the there's multiple ways you can do that, multiple approaches you can take. But it's actually going to be the specific context that actually determines which is going to be the most relevant and most effective form of action in any given instance. And therefore, the reason is dealing with a specific circumstance, and your warrant is dealing with a general circumstance. So, basically the warrant is sort of the general principle upon which the specific your specific circumstance deals with. And so with also number 4, your audience must also accept as true that the specific consequence in the claim, because your claim is suggesting that there's a consequence, or there's a so what involved. Because if there isn't a so what, then no one cares. Why are you making the argument? There's nothing to argue. So that your audience must assume that that the specific consequence in the claim qualifies as a plausible instance of the general consequence in the warrant. So I know that's probably really confusing at this point, and you're kind of rereading these multiple times, and you're like, "What? I'm not sure I get this." So actually, we're going to unpack this even more in just a moment. But what I want to get across at this moment is that reasons and claims deal with specific circumstances. So, reason deals with a specific circumstance, and a claim has a specific consequence. So reasons and claims deal with specifics. Warrants always deal with the generals, general principles. There's a general circumstance and a general consequence. So warrants are about general principles, general consequences, general circumstances. Reasons and claims are about the specifics. If you keep that in mind as we move on to the next section, this next part here, you'll be in good shape. So this is taken, I believe, from page 115 of the Craft of Research. And you can see here, if along the top of this graphic, we have the general circumstance predictably leads to the general consequence. So again, warrants, general circumstance, general consequence. And so, if there's a general circumstance, there's going to be a general consequence related to that circumstance. And what they have here is when an area has few hard freezes, a general circumstance, it will pay more to combat diseases carried by subtropical insects no longer killed by hard freezes. So there's a general circumstance, fewer hard freezes, and the consequences of fewer hard freezes is that subtropical insects are no longer killed by those hard freezes, and subtropical insects carry diseases, and therefore we're going to have to spend more money to combat those diseases, both in actually treating people who have been infected by the diseases and in eradicating the subtropical insects by means other than the natural regulation through freezing, through kind of cold temperatures. So those are the warrants kind of involved with this argument. If we look at the bottom part of the graphic, we have the specific circumstance lets us infer a specific consequence. So, if the general circumstance is true and the general consequence that comes out of that general circumstance is true, and the specific circumstance is true, then we can kind of make a reasonable prediction about what the specific consequence is going to be. And so that's basically how a warrant works. It's how an argument, the logic behind an argument works. And if we look at the specifics here, global warming is moving the line of extended hard freezes steadily north. That's the reason. So we are facing significantly higher healthcare costs. That's the claim. And so if we look again at those two together, global warming is moving the line of extended hard freezes steadily north, so we are facing significant higher health costs. Well, why are we facing that? Why is global warming? Why does this idea of the hard freezes moving north, the line, more hard freezes take place moving north? Why is that? Raising healthcare costs? The warrant deals with that. When there's fewer hard freezes, you have fewer subtropical insects are killed by those hard freezes. Subtropical insects carry diseases, and therefore we're going to have to spend more money to deal with those diseases. Also added into this, we might talk about geography. When the hard freeze, the line moves farther north, that means that more territory is, that means that the territory of the subtropical insects expands. Greater territory, which means more people might be affected, not just by population, but by the expansion of the population of the subtropical insects, all of which lead to more disease, or potential or risk for disease, which means more money to both treat the disease and try to eradicate the carriers of disease. So, so you can see kind of how that logic works. This is the the logic there, and that the four conditions that an audience must agree with to accept a warrant, so a warrant's role in connecting a claim and a reason. So, moving on, I want to talk about arguments all the way down. This idea that we build arguments upon arguments. So while the claim, because of reason based on evidence, is the base formula for a research argument, only the most simple arguments will be built upon a claim supported by one reason. Hopefully that makes sense. Most arguments, most sort of advanced complex issues are going to require have a multiple number of factors involved. We actually just even saw that in the example of TV and violence, we can just point to that one paragraph, had two claims with evidence supporting both those claims, and one claim 2 supporting actually claim 2 serving as the reason for claim 1. So the idea that an argument is built upon arguments, building upon arguments. So, again, most arguments will involve a claim supported by multiple reasons, with these reasons serving as subclaims that require their own reasons, and all the while, all these claims and reasons need their own evidence, and they all may need their own acknowledgments and responses as well. We can use this understanding. So if you understand this, that you have to build arguments upon arguments, then we can actually we can use that understanding to help us think about how we actually build this argument. So if we were going to make this argument that we are facing significantly higher health costs in Europe and North America because global warming is moving the line of extended hard freezes steadily northward, if we understand that we actually have to support this claim with reasons that are themselves claims supported by evidence, which then are supported by, more reasons, which are also supported by evidence, et cetera, going all the way down. We can then figure out what things we actually have to argue. So, if you think about your audience, to understand this argument, to understand this argument itself, an audience is going to need to understand the connections between hard freezes, subtropical insects, disease, medical costs, and really you're actually also going to, though it's embedded in the actual claim, it's the initial claim and reason, needs to understand even the idea that warming temperatures means that the area that experiences hard freezes is going to move northward. So our audience needs to understand all those things to actually understand the argument we're trying to make. And they need to actually accept each of these things as true before they will accept the entire argument, because we need to build them upon each other. So we know kind of everything our audience needs. If we think about this, we can figure out everything our audience is going to need to understand, all the little arguments we're going to need to make. We can then think about how we want to put, what's the logical order to put these arguments in to walk our audience through this claim. And when you present an argument, you may present the major claim at the start and then say, okay, to understand this, we first need to look at issues A, B, C, D, and E, and let's walk through them. So let's talk about how we might walk through them. First, we might want to make a connection between an increase in disease and an increase in medical costs, or the increase in the risk of disease and the increase of medical costs. We may need to explain this, talk about that when people get sick, they require that increased medical costs to treat them getting sick, and that we also, if there's increased risk of disease, it's not even just the disease itself, but the increased risk of disease means that we want to actually do things to actively decrease that risk. And therefore, if nature is not decreasing that risk on its own, we need to actually have our own interventions, and those interventions often cost money. Related to medical costs, public health issues. And so, we may need to explain that, or we may not need to. Or we may need to explain part of it, but not all of it. And so at some point, you might say, if we have an audience that's well informed, we might say, okay, they're going to understand this connection between an increase in disease, or the increase in the risk of disease, and how that's going to increase medical costs, including costs of public health and disease suppression. So there's our first warrant. To understand, if our audience understands that connection, we don't need to explain it to them, but we can rely on their understanding of that connection to understand the connection between the next claim and reason we need to, or the next reason and claim we need to get them to accept. So having done that, or deciding that our audience will understand that part, so we don't need to explain it, we then might need to talk about the relationship between diseases and subtropical insects. This idea that subtropical insects often carry disease. We may need to define what subtropical insects are. Mosquitoes is one, is a common one, and a common disease vector. So we need to make that connection for our audience. And once we've made that connection for our audience, we then need to make the connection between hard freezes and subtropical insect population. This idea that hard freezes act as a natural environmental regulator of subtropical insect populations. Extended hard freezes produce cold enough temperatures that actually kill off large portions of a population, so that every year a large part of the population that was born that year dies, and rather than having just the populations just carry on over and over and over without dying off every year and getting larger increase in numbers. So once we've then made that connection for our audience, we then may need to make the connection between increased global temperatures and the moving of, and the position of the hard freeze lines. Explain how the fact that the temperatures, there are increased global temperatures, that it's getting warmer, how that affects the hard freeze line. And how that also, increases the territory in which subtropical insects are not going to be killed by hard freezes every year, etc. So having done that, Once our audience understands all those connections and how they all relate to each other, and we've walked them through it in a logical order so that they understand, get the sort of the base point A, walk them to point B, show them how point A actually supports point B, how point B supports point C, how point C supports point D. Then and only then are they ready to actually understand our main claim. So, they're now then ready to understand how global warming can lead to increased medical costs. So, working with claims, reasons, and evidence. When working with claims, you want to consider the following. What kind of claim are you making? Is it a conceptual claim or a practical claim? Another way of putting that is, are you trying to make an argument that your audience needs to understand a concept, or are you trying to make an argument that your audience needs to take an action, needs to act on something? The argument about the increased global temperatures, moving hard freeze lines northward, thereby will create greater medical costs, is a conceptual argument as opposed to a practical one. One thing I will note here when it comes to issues of practical claims and conceptual claims is that we have plenty of research now that tells us that just because people understand something does not mean that they're going to act on it. Understanding is not sufficient in most cases to actually lead to action. People need very specific reasons to actually act, other than just a broad understanding. If you think about this in terms of issues like lots of health issues, actually, we all know that exercise is good for us. Exercise helps lower our risk for multiple diseases. There are a lot of people who don't get nearly enough exercise. We know that sufficient sleep, helps your immune system actually, and that extended periods of little sleep increases stress, increases depression, increases obesity, increases all these things. There's a lot of health risks, health problems that come from getting too little sleep. Yet America is known as a population of adults that do not get enough sleep each night. We know that smoking is bad for us, but we've known that for decades now. Though the number of smokers has decreased since the 70s and 80s, but we still have plenty of people taking up smoking every year. Likewise, we know that sugar is bad for us. Yet people eat way too much sugar in our diet. And so just because we know these things doesn't actually mean that we're going to change our lifestyle behaviors. So a conceptual argument is not in and of itself going to get people to move into action, but you may actually need to make a conceptual argument before you can make the practical argument. So if your goal is actually to get people to act on something, maybe they do know why they need to act. Maybe they have the understanding, so then therefore you just need to give them these specific reasons that make it personal enough that they then act. But you may actually need to start with a conceptual argument before you actually get them before you can actually give them the practical one. So you want to think about what kind of claim you're making. You also want to ask if your claim is specific. Again, this is if you think about this, if you go back to the discussions of the nth meme in week 1, both the handout and the lectures talked about the need for precision in your when making nth memes. The same as here when you're making claims. You want to basically everything I've talked about in terms of enthymemes and being precise, being specific is irrelevant here as well. And finally, you want to make sure your claim is significant. As I talked about the first week in the lectures from the first week, worthwhile arguments are arguments upon which reasonable people will disagree. If reasonable people aren't going to disagree about it, it's not really, you might be fun as a game or something, but it's not an issue that really warrants serious engagement as an argument. Same as that's basically kind of getting at what the claim is. Is your claim significant? they in the craft of research, they mention something about the character Hamlet, and they give you a significant example and insignificant example. You know, the idea, ooh, Hamlet's an interesting character. Okay, yeah, we've got a guy who, you know, thinks he's seen his father as a ghost, and his father's ghost is telling him to kill his mother and his uncle. He is may or may not be crazy. He may just be faking that he's crazy. He may actually be crazy. His uncle sees him so much of a threat that he's got his best friends sent off to with him to get him executed by another king, because, you know, the uncle doesn't want to actually kill his brother's son, who is the legitimate heir to the throne. He is actually actively undermining. Because his life's so screwed up, he actually treats his love interest horribly and drives her doesn't just even drive her insane, actually drives her to suicide. Okay, yeah. We may not like the guy, but that's an interesting person. That's the kind of person drama is made from. So the claim, Hamlet's an interesting character, there's nothing significant about that. The argument, Hamlet, you know, we shouldn't care about Hamlet because he's a jerk. There's some significance there. There's, you know, that's like, okay, because maybe you want to argue, you know, maybe you believe you're one of the people who believe he's faking it, his craziness, and so he's faking his craziness to, you know, drive his girlfriend insane to suicide and everything else. Yeah, that's a jerk, but there's an argument there. There's something significant about that. So, you know, is your claim one upon which reasoned people are actually going to find worth talking about in a way that is opens up a conversation? So you want to make sure that you're making that kind of an argument. Okay, moving on. We talked about working with claims. Now I want to talk about working with reasons and evidence. When you're working with reason and evidence, you want to make sure that your reasons are supported by sufficient evidence. What counts as sufficient is going to depend upon your audience. So again, you need to kind of figure out who your audience is, what your audience needs to know, and then offer them that evidence. Until you really get good at offering evidence, one of the things I'll actually say, is that one of the big problems, sort of inexperienced or kind of people who are sort of newer to making arguments and newer to sort of engaging in academic writing, they assume, you know, that the audience understands a lot more than the audience actually does. So one of the things you need to be aware of is that you actually understand what you're saying, you understand the argument you're making, you understand the logic you're working from, you understand the evidence that you're dealing with, because it's all in your head. You know, I mean, so of course you understand it because it's you. You have access to all that information. Your audience only has access to the information that you put before them. And we know from cognitive psychology, there's the idea of priming the pump in terms of memory. The way actually our memory works is that our memory, we get, you know, we hear something, our working memory then sort of runs a search query. You know, it's the metaphors, the analogy is a little off, but basically sort of sends out and sort of figures out what we know and draws all that information that we know about the topic into working memory. And so if you've ever like heard someone say something and you actually heard the words but it made no sense to you until they then repeated it a second time, the reason why it didn't make sense is because you weren't ready for it. You didn't have enough context that you actually could not process it in a meaningful way, even though you actually understand all the concepts, you understood all the words, you just didn't have the context to process it at that moment. So you had to hear it a second time, and then you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I got it. That's the thing here. Your audience may know all this information, but they may not have thought about this information in the context of what you're talking about. And so you often need to be more explicit. You often need to explain more. You often need to provide more evidence than you think your audience may know. And you might, you know, worry about erring. Giving more than you think you might need and over time you kind of get a better sense of what you need to do, what you don't need to do. And so at this point you may actually want to assume that you need to give your audience more than you think they're going to need. You also want to make sure that the evidence you're using is actually the evidence itself rather than reports of evidence. If you've been following the news the last couple days, we have a controversy in the presidential debate. Hillary Clinton recently said that, I think on last week, said that a good number of Donald Trump supporters are deplorable. And in the last couple days, journalists have asked Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate, if he would refer to David Duke, who's a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, a former Nazi, like a Hitler fanboy kind of guy, who's now big with the alt-right, for pushing anti-Semitic, racist ideas under the idea of supporting European values. Mike Pence has been asked, would you use the word deplorable? Would you define Donald Trump as deplorable? And Mike Pence has said no. And so we've got a bunch of headlines running around going, Mike Pence won't call David Duke deplorable. You actually listen to what those reports of what Mike Pence has said. If you actually listen to Mike Pence responding to those questions, he refuses to use the word deplorable, but he actually says that he repudiates David Duke's anti-Semitism, his racism. He has no interest in David Duke supporting him. He has no interest or need for David Duke's followers to support him. He's repudiating David Duke. He just doesn't want to. He is just using the word deplorable. But if you were to go by a bunch of headlines that are running around on the internet, in newspapers, little sound bites on TV, what you're hearing is that basically Mike Pence won't repudiate David Duke because he won't use the word deplorable. Which is not true. So that right there, I think, is a good example of why you want to actually get the evidence itself. Look up what Mike Pence actually said in response to those questions, rather than just relying upon the reports of evidence. And that goes for everything. That goes for even academic research. Academic researchers, academic writers misrepresent things, either intentionally or more often by accident. Laziness, sloppiness, rushed too quickly, misremembered, miscopied. And so if you just rely upon a report of evidence, you might be getting something that's not true. So it's always better to get the evidence itself rather than rely upon a report of evidence. And the more important, the more crucial the evidence is to your argument, the more important it is that you actually go to the evidence itself. And so finally, the last part, when dealing with claims, reasons, and evidence, you want to make sure that you are representing the evidence. You want to make sure that your representation of evidence is accurate, precise, and sufficiently representative. Now, if you think back to last week when we talked about summarizing, paraphrasing, and using quotations, talked about all those issues of making sure that you actually represent that your source accurately, you represent your resource precisely, sort of represent it how it's actually being presented, the term, kind of if it's got qualifiers, if it's got if they're hedging, if they're expressing a very strong opinion, if they're dealing with something that's incredibly certain about what they're saying, or if they're saying, yeah, we kind of think maybe this might be the case. You want to make sure that you're accurate, you're representing that precisely, using the precise so people can actually understand the context. And finally, you want to make sure that you are being sufficiently representative of your evidence. Just sort of, ask 20 people what they think and get 2 answers that you like. Say, okay, well, I asked 20 people, and this is, here's what people think about this based on the 20 people I asked. When what you've done is just sort of cherry picked. You want to make sure that you are being sufficiently representative of what you're of your sources, of what we know to be the case. Okay, so the last issue we're going to talk about in this lecture is developing ethos. You may have come across ethos, pathos, and logos in other places, either in high school or in your English 101 class, or if you had some study in philosophy. But basically, ethos is one of the 3 modes of persuasion that Aristotle lays out in his Rhetoric. I mentioned them in the first week's lecture. And I think, or maybe it might have been actually it's probably the second week's lecture talking about reading and analyzing rhetorically. And so ethos is one of Aristotle's modes of persuasion. Ethos oftentimes is sort of summarized by people as having to do with ethics or credibility. However, in actuality, when Aristotle talks about ethos, he actually means arguments that are based upon the character of the author, character of the rhetor, character of the speaker, character of the person making the argument. And character there sort of references the quality of the person. And so they're arguments that are based in the person themselves. An example of that, who the person is, what they do for a living, if they're an expert in something, how they act, if they're, are they a credible and honest person. Those are all issues of ethos. And if you've got someone who's a known liar, who lies all the time, who deceives people whenever it's to their advantage, you're not as likely we're not going to be as likely to trust that person. That person has a problem with their ethos. Another example here is that a Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher is going to have a far greater ethos when it comes to dealing with issues of cancer than your average bus driver. And putting this another way, if I were to tell you that we actually have the cure to cancer right here, right now, I've got two people you have to choose. One is a Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher, the other is a homeless person. You have to tell me who has the answer for the cure for cancer, and if you're right, we get to cure cancer. If you're wrong, we destroy the formula and cancer continues. Which person are you going to go with? You're going to go with the Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher, or are you going to go with the homeless person? Of course, most people are going to say, any reasonable person is going to go with the Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher because they're the person who is most likely to actually have developed the cure for cancer. In that context, Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher, homeless person. And so that is an issue there of ethos. It doesn't mean that either of us is a better person than the other. It just means in that context, the person who is most likely to be credible, the person who's most likely to have actually developed the cure for cancer is the person who has won a Nobel Prize for researching cancer. So, most of us, on the other hand, are never going to be Nobel Prize winners. We're not going to, be able to just pull out a Nobel Prize and say, you should listen to me because I have a Nobel Prize on this very topic. So what are we going to do? How do we develop our ethos? We do that by demonstrating that we have taken the time and care to thoughtfully work through the issue that we are arguing. That means that we've consulted good sources, that we have asked good questions, that we've considered the issue from multiple perspectives, and in doing so, we have actually incorporated the ideas and opinions and concerns of others, and we've established reasoned responses to those concerns. All those things can actually establish good ethos. Other ways of establishing good ethos is actually just coming across as someone who is trying to work towards an understanding, work towards a compromise, work towards recognizing that other people have real issues and concerns. If you want to give an example, years ago I had a student who basically wanted to make an argument that we shouldn't raise the minimum wage, and then this is a direct quote, this is what she wanted to argue: if you disagree with me, you're stupid. Now think about that. Do you want to actually, what's going to be your response if someone just looks at you and says, issue X, you believe what I'm telling you, or you're stupid? You're not going to, we aren't going to want to deal with them. You're not going to want to really engage them. Or if you're going to engage them, you're going to engage them in a hostile manner because they're being a jerk. They're not someone who is really demonstrating respect or a desire to really deal with an issue in an honest, open, intellectual way. So you can establish ethos by not being one of those people and actually by trying to demonstrate that you are someone who is working through the issue carefully and thoughtfully and trying to take in, listen and in a way that listens to other people. We can break this down as Booth, Coleman, Williams explain, we can actually reduce this issue of ethos down to one question. Can I trust you? That's what you're trying to do. You are basically trying to demonstrate to your audience that they can trust you on this issue. And there are multiple ways to do that. We've just kind of walked through them. Even if you're not an expert in a subject, you do the research to demonstrate that you've done the research and that you're working with the research well. And this is actually this is the reasons why you want to be precise. You want to represent your information accurately. You don't want to misrepresent sources. You don't want to lie in your making your arguments, because you actually, if they're discovered, if you've discovered that you've been misrepresenting sources, that you've been making up sources, that you are lying about things, you've destroyed your credibility. It could be anything from, well, this person's just fundamentally dishonest, so I'm not going to deal with them. Or it could be like, well, this person really has been really sloppy and careless in doing their research, or this person really has only looked at a couple sources and really hasn't investigated this topic well. Therefore, I don't know that I can, sure, they might be saying something interesting, but they don't have the context, they don't have the engagement with the issue to be really to be making a really important statement, or there's the risk that they're not because they haven't engaged it well. So that's, again, sort of what you want to think about in terms of developing your ethos there. This question of, can people trust you, and how you can demonstrate that they can trust you. And practicing the good conventions that we've been talking about, that Booth, Williams, and Colum talk about, and they've talked about in the lectures. Those are ways that you can establish your ethos. Okay, again, if you have questions, please post them to the the general discussion forums in Blackboard, or you can also raise these sort of issues as relevant in your weekly discussion posts. And thank you.